History likes to dress duels up as noble, elegant, honorable affairs. Very dramatic, very dignified, very stupid. Because behind all that smoke, silk, and "sir, you have offended me," you often find two grown adults risking death over soup, hats, theater credits, bad dancing, wet dogs, spelling, or one laugh that landed badly. These are 32 of the stupidest duels in history, where human pride looked common sense directly in the eye and shot first. 1. Lord Byron built his brand on gloom, scandal, and looking like he had personally been betrayed by the weather. But the family talent for dramatic disaster was already alive and thriving in his great-uncle William Byron, the 5th Baron Byron, better known as the Wicked Lord. And honestly, when history gives you a nickname like that, it is usually not because you were great at gardening. In 1765, Byron was drinking in a London tavern with his neighbor and cousin, William Cheworth, when they began arguing about whose estate had more wild game for hunting. Not land, not money, not some dark family secret. Deer, pheasants, and bragging rights. The alcohol did what alcohol does best, took a stupid conversation and handed it a sword. The two men withdrew to a private room, drew blades in candlelight, and fought like two overfed aristocrats defending the honor of their backyards. Byron stabbed Cheworth, who died soon after. A man lost his life because two rich cousins could not calmly compare wildlife populations. 2. Everyone wants credit for their work, especially in theater, where applause is basically oxygen and being ignored feels like being buried alive in public. But one Copenhagen theater director took professional disappointment and inflated it into full historical madness. After the premiere of his new play, he opened the printed program, expecting to see his name proudly displayed like a little paper monument to his genius. Instead, nothing. His name had been left out completely. The press secretary had forgotten him, which is embarrassing, yes, but normally fixed with an apology, a reprint, or one very tense office meeting. The director, however, saw something much deeper. To him, this was not a clerical mistake. This was artistic murder with ink. His identity had been erased. His brilliance had been shoved into the trash bin of typography. So instead of writing an angry letter, he challenged the press secretary to a duel. Imagine almost dying because someone messed up the program layout. Theater people do not play when the credits are wrong. 3. Modern political rivalries usually end with leaks, interviews, and someone posting a statement that begins with the words, "to be clear." In early 19th century Britain, apparently, senior government officials skipped the public relations team and went straight to pistols. Lord Castlereagh, the Secretary of War, and George Canning, the Foreign Secretary, despised each other with that special professional hatred only ambitious men in the same government can produce. Their rivalry was a poisonous stew of ego, jealousy, policy disputes, and personal contempt. Then Canning secretly plotted to have Castlereagh removed from his post because nothing says teamwork like trying to politically remove your colleague behind his back. Castlereagh found out and decided the proper response was not resignation, not a scandal, and not a fiery speech in Parliament. He challenged Canning to a duel. In September 1809, two of Britain's most important ministers met in a field and shot at each other. Canning missed. Castlereagh hit him in the thigh. It was basically a cabinet meeting with gunpowder. 4. Some people become martyrs for freedom, faith, or justice. One Irish gentleman in London became a martyr for spelling, which is a much harder slogan to put on a statue. During a heated intellectual argument, two men began fighting over the correct spelling of a Greek word. A normal person might consult a dictionary, ask a scholar, or quietly change the subject before everyone realizes he has been bluffing since dessert. But these two decided that the position of one letter was not a matter of language, it was a matter of honor. The debate grew hotter and more ridiculous until a simple word became a battlefield. They were not defending a kingdom, they were defending orthography with blades. Finally, they challenged each other to a sword duel because apparently reference books were not masculine enough. In the fight that followed, one man was killed. His opponent technically won the argument, but only in the most deranged way possible. In that moment, the sword became the world's dumbest spell checker. 5. Billiards is supposed to be a calm, smoky, civilized game where people lean dramatically over a table and pretend the angle of a shot is a matter of philosophy. But in 1843, two Frenchmen named Melfort and L'Enfant managed to turn it into indoor battlefield engineering. Their argument began during a game, probably over a rule, a shot, or some tiny technical detail that no sane person would remember the next morning. Unfortunately, sanity had apparently left the room before the chalk was even applied to the cue. The dispute escalated until both men decided honor had been insulted and must be restored. Then came the worst idea in the room. Instead of going outside with proper dueling weapons, they used billiard balls. Heavy, hard-polished balls of concentrated regret. They stood apart, and Melfort threw first with terrifying force. The ball struck L'Enfant directly in the forehead and killed him instantly. A man died over a game whose final score nobody cared about 5 minutes later. 6. Ben Jonson is remembered as one of the great playwrights of the English Renaissance, a major literary figure who worked in the same era as Shakespeare. But he was also, unfortunately, the kind of man who could turn creative disagreement into a homicide investigation. In 1598, Jonson got into a bitter quarrel with an actor named Gabriel Spencer. The exact reason is unclear, but it likely involved theater business, a performance, a play, or some bruised artistic ego. In other words, the normal fuel of backstage chaos. The argument did not stay in the world of words, reviews, and dramatic sighing. It moved to Hoxton Fields, where the two men fought a duel. Jonson had a shorter sword and was wounded in the arm, which would have been a good time to consider the life choices that led him there. Instead, he proved the better swordsman, disarmed Spencer, and fatally stabbed him. Jonson was arrested and nearly hanged, escaping execution through the legal loophole called benefit of clergy. That is one way to give notes on an actor's performance. 7. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the fierce American Civil War cavalry commander, was not the sort of man you wanted to mock, challenge, or probably even surprise from behind. Lieutenant Andrew Wills Gould discovered this in the most fatal way imaginable. During a gathering, Forrest was telling a story when Gould laughed. That was the offense. A laugh. Maybe it was too loud, maybe too sarcastic, maybe badly timed. Or maybe Forrest simply heard it through the filter of a man whose pride was made of dry gunpowder. Instead of taking the laugh as amusement, Forrest interpreted it as mockery. Suddenly, Gould was not just a listener with unfortunate timing. He was a man disrespecting a dangerous superior and insulting his storytelling abilities, which is apparently a category of honor violation. The confrontation escalated violently, and Forrest killed the lieutenant. It is a chilling reminder that in some company, humor is not harmless. Sometimes the difference between a friendly laugh and a death sentence depends entirely on how insecure the armed man across from you is feeling. 8. Some duels are stupid because of why they happen. This one is extra stupid because it happened over a duel that did not happen. Thomas Reynolds once challenged Benjamin Brown to fight, but Brown managed to avoid the confrontation through negotiation and diplomacy, which most functioning adults would call a success. Reynolds called it cowardice. Apparently, walking away from a gunfight was not considered survival. It was considered branding yourself as poultry. Reynolds began publicly insulting Brown, calling him a coward so often that the accusation started sticking to his reputation like mud on a white coat. Brown eventually felt boxed in by the endless slander. To prove he had not been afraid to fight the first duel, he accepted a second one. This is the kind of logic that makes your brain knock on the inside of your skull and ask to leave. The duel finally took place, and Brown was shot in the leg. He had to get wounded to prove he was not the kind of man who avoided getting wounded. Honor culture was basically a trap with good handwriting. 9. Most grudges eventually fade because people get tired, distracted, older, or simply discover better hobbies. Pierre Dupont and François Fournier-Sarlovez did not. Their hatred lasted 19 years and produced more than 30 duels, which is less a feud and more a deeply unhealthy lifestyle choice. It began in 1794 when Fournier, a hot-headed French hussar, delivered a message to Dupont and felt he had been treated disrespectfully. That tiny slight somehow grew into a long-running personal war. They fought with sabers on horseback, swords on foot, and pistols when they needed variety, like two men trapped in a violent subscription plan they forgot to cancel. They would wound each other, recover, then arrange the next encounter with the grim routine of men scheduling dental appointments. The feud ended in 1813, when DuPont finally outwitted Fournier in a pistol duel involving two guns drawn from a bag, only one of which was loaded. Fournier picked the empty pistol. DuPont had him helpless, then refused to kill him. After 19 years, mercy finally did what common sense should have done immediately. 10. Jonathan Silly may have suffered one of history's most absurd, fatal consequences of refusing to accept mail. In 1838, Silly, a United States congressman from Maine, was caught in a political feud with newspaper editor James Webb, who had accused him of corruption. Another congressman, William Graves of Kentucky, stepped in as a messenger and tried to deliver a letter from Webb to Silly. Silly wanted no part of Webb and refused to accept the letter. That should have been the whole story. Awkward. Yes. Deadly? Absolutely not. But Graves decided that Silly's refusal insulted him personally as the gentleman carrying the message. Not the contents of the letter, not the accusation, the refusal to physically receive the paper. Graves challenged Silly to a duel. Silly had never fired a gun in his life, but he was pushed into fighting with rifles. On the third shot, he was killed. He died because he essentially told a political delivery man, "No thank you, return to sender." 11. We have all endured a boring sermon, lecture, meeting, or presentation while silently wondering whether time itself had been murdered. But the Chevalier de Guise, a 17th century French officer, apparently believed dullness could become a capital offense. After attending a church service, he was so offended by the sermon delivered by the Abbé de Gondi that he decided normal criticism was not enough. He did not simply complain that the priest had poor pacing or needed stronger material. No, he claimed the sermon was an insult to God and all of mankind. That is not feedback. That is a theological customer complaint with lethal escalation. The Chevalier felt the sermon's boredom had wounded not only his patience, but the dignity of creation itself. So he challenged the preacher to a duel. Imagine being a priest and discovering that your homily did not merely fail to inspire. It created an armed incident. History has produced many harsh reviews, but "Your sermon was so boring I demand blood" may be the most aggressive audience response ever recorded. 12. The duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton is one of the most famous violent moments in American political history, but the final spark was painfully petty. Gossip, bruised pride, and letters that grew more hostile with every exchange. Hamilton had allegedly made insulting remarks about Burr at a private dinner, describing him as dangerous and untrustworthy. Later, those comments appeared in a newspaper because apparently political gossip has always loved finding a printing press. Burr demanded a sweeping apology and retraction for every negative thing Hamilton had ever said or written about him. That was not a request. That was asking a lifelong political enemy to apologize for years of existing with opinions. Hamilton refused to apologize for vague, unpublished remarks he could not fully identify, and the language between them hardened into a duel challenge. They met at Weehawken, New Jersey, where Burr, then the sitting vice president, shot Hamilton, the former Secretary of the Treasury. A rivalry that shaped the early United States ended in blood over reported dinner table insults. American politics has rarely been calm, but this was especially dramatic. 13. Challenging Otto von Bismarck to a duel sounded like a terrible plan for almost anyone with a pulse. The man was the Iron Chancellor, a political force whose personality seemed to have been forged out of steel, pressure, and permanent displeasure. But Rudolf Virchow, his political rival, was not trying to win a conventional duel. He was a pathologist, a scientist, and apparently a master of weaponized humiliation. When Bismarck challenged him, Virchow had the right to choose the weapons. Instead of swords or pistols, he presented two pork sausages. One was perfectly safe. The other, he explained, was infected with deadly trichinella parasites, invisible without a microscope. Bismarck was invited to choose one sausage and eat it. Suddenly, the mighty champion of blood and iron faced a choice between lunch and a horrifying death by parasitic worms. It was not a duel anymore. It was Russian roulette with meat. Bismarck wisely declined. Virchow defeated him not with a blade, but with biology and a terrifyingly confident sausage. 14. Richard Martin was an Irish member of Parliament known as Humanity Dick, a nickname he earned through his work defending animals from cruelty. He helped push early animal welfare laws and became associated with what would later become the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Which makes it especially bizarre that he once decided the proper response to animal suffering was possibly killing a human. The issue involved his goat, which had been wandering into the flower garden of his neighbor, Baron George Gort, and destroying the plants with the cheerful entitlement of a goat that had never respected property rights. Gort finally snapped and shot the animal. Martin did not see this as the end of a gardening dispute. He saw it as a personal outrage against a beloved creature. So he challenged Gort to a duel. The man, publicly devoted to preventing cruelty, wanted to answer the death of a goat with the potential death of a neighbor. His compassion was real, but for one wild moment it came wrapped in murder logic. 15. Before Tycho Brahe became one of the most important astronomers in European history, he was a hot-blooded student who managed to lose part of his nose over mathematics. While studying in Germany, Brahe got into an argument with his own cousin, Mandara Parsberg, over which of them was the better mathematician. This is the kind of dispute that should end with equations, chalk dust, and one smug cousin proving the other wrong. Instead, they decided to resolve it with swords in the dark because apparently nothing says mathematical superiority like stabbing a family member. During the duel, Parsberg's blade slashed across Brahe's face and cut off the bridge of his nose. For the rest of his life, Brahe wore a prosthetic nose, often described as made from brass or silver-colored metal. Imagine becoming a giant in astronomy while wearing a permanent reminder that you once let a math argument escalate into face surgery. He studied the heavens, but his nose paid the price for earthly stupidity. 16. Charles-Augustin Sainte-Beuve was one of France's most feared literary critics, a man whose reviews could either elevate a writer or make him feel like he had been publicly buried under adjectives. After Sainte-Beuve wrote a particularly harsh critique of a new book, the offended author reacted exactly as insecure writers of the age sometimes did. He challenged the critic to a duel. Sainte-Beuve accepted, though he was clearly more comfortable drawing blood with sentences than bullets. On the day of the duel, rain began to fall. As the two men prepared their pistols, Sainte-Beuve calmly raised an umbrella over his head. His opponent was baffled. What kind of person brings an umbrella to a duel? Sainte-Beuve's answer was beautifully practical. He was willing to be killed, but he was not willing to get wet. That line is almost too perfect. The duel went ahead, neither man landed a shot, and the umbrella became more famous than the fight. Even when facing death, Sainte-Beuve refused to lose to weather. 17. In the 18th century, honor could apparently be damaged by many things: words, gestures, hats, dances, and in this case, dog water. A gentleman named Mr. Broxop had a dog that went for a swim in a river. Afterward, the dog did what every wet dog has done since the beginning of wet dogs. It shook itself dry with total commitment and zero concern for human fashion. Unfortunately, some of the spray landed on the dresses of two nearby ladies. Captain Fleetwood witnessed this scene and somehow interpreted it not as a normal animal behavior, but as a grave insult. To him, the slightly damp dresses demanded justice. Since challenging the dog would have made the situation even more ridiculous, he challenged the owner. Mr. Broxop was suddenly facing a duel because his pet had behaved like a pet. Imagine coming home and explaining that tomorrow might be your final day because the dog enjoyed a swim too enthusiastically. The animal probably had no idea it had nearly caused a homicide. 18. Picture an 18th century French dinner party. Fine clothes, expensive wine, candlelight, and two aristocrats slowly losing their minds over the aviation capabilities of frogs. The Marquis de Saint-Four and the Count de Rivière began debating whether frogs could fly. One man insisted the humble frog had aerial potential. The other strongly disagreed, probably because he had encountered both frogs and gravity. As the wine continued flowing, this bizarre scientific dispute became personal. The question was no longer, can frogs fly? It became, are you calling me an idiot in front of dinner? A reasonable solution would have been to test the theory with a frog, a safe height, and maybe one person sober enough to observe. But these were aristocrats, so the experiment became a duel. They drew swords, fought, and one of them was wounded. No frog achieved flight. No scientific truth was advanced. But history did gain proof that rich men, wine, and wounded pride can turn even pond biology into a stabbing incident. 19. Food is supposed to bring people together, but in 18th century Ukraine, borscht apparently had enough emotional power to cause bloodshed. During a grand feast, two nobles, Adam Zholkevsky and Ivan Kvasnevsky, began arguing over the proper way to make borscht. This was not a friendly exchange of family recipes. This was soup treated like sacred law. Which beets were correct? Which herbs belonged? Was one ingredient traditional brilliance or a crime against the ancestors? Somewhere in the middle of dinner, the argument stopped being culinary and became personal. Their families, reputations, and probably several dead grandmothers were dragged into the pot. The insult became so serious that only swords could settle it, because apparently no one suggested tasting both versions like civilized adults. The duel ended with Zholkevsky wounding Kvasnevsky, which by the rules of absurd aristocratic logic may have made his borscht the winner by combat. It is a terrifying warning: never casually criticize someone's national soup unless you know where the exits are. 20. Backstage drama has existed as long as theater itself, but in 1735, London's Drury Lane Theatre managed to turn a wig argument into a fatal disaster. Actors Charles Macklin and Thomas Hallam were preparing for a performance when they began fighting over a wig Hallam was supposed to wear. In a normal workplace, this might have become a complaint to wardrobe, a tense conversation, or one actor silently plotting revenge through bad eye contact. Macklin, however, was known for a fierce temper, and the argument quickly became violent. In a burst of rage, he lunged at Hallam with a walking stick that was either sharpened or fitted with a hard metal point. The stick pierced Hallam's eye and entered his brain, killing him. All of this began over theatrical hair. It was grotesque, senseless, and almost impossibly stupid. Actors often say the show must go on, but there should probably be a footnote saying nobody should die over the wig budget. 21. In 19th century France, accessories were not always just accessories. Sometimes they were political symbols, social declarations, and apparently possible tickets to a rolling knife fight. Colonel Barbier Dufay took offense to the cockade worn on the hat of Captain Raoul de Vere. A cockade was a decorative ribbon, but in that era, it could carry political meaning. So insulting one could feel like insulting a cause, a flag, and a man's entire identity all at once. Still, the way they chose to settle the matter was wildly deranged. Instead of a standard duel in a field, they agreed to be locked inside a moving carriage with daggers, while the driver circled continuously until one man was dead. A cramped carriage, sharp knives, constant movement, all over a hat ribbon. Imagine bouncing around in the dark, trying to stab another man while the vehicle rocks beneath you, because someone said something rude about your headwear. Fashion history rarely gets this sweaty and insane. 22. The Prussian military was famous for discipline, order, and an almost religious devotion to rules. Unfortunately, when honor becomes that sensitive, even a clothing mistake can become fatal. One Prussian baron attended a military function and afterward accidentally picked up another officer's cap. That is it. He grabbed the wrong hat. In a normal society, this ends with an apology, a laugh, and maybe the phrase, "sorry, they looked similar." But in the world of Prussian military pride, this minor mix-up was treated as a serious breach of protocol and a personal insult to the cap's owner. The offended officer demanded a duel. The baron, whose crime was basically hat confusion, was killed. He did not betray military secrets. He did not insult the king. He did not sabotage a battle plan. He wore the wrong cap and paid for it with his life. It is hard to imagine a more extreme example of bureaucracy, ego, and wardrobe combining into one fatal nonsense machine. 23. Boredom can be dangerous, especially when the bored people are 17th century French aristocrats with swords and far too much free time. Two noblemen found themselves with nothing interesting to do and apparently decided that conversation, cards, reading, walking, or simply going to sleep were all unacceptable options. Instead, they chose a duel. There was no grave insult, no romantic betrayal, no political rivalry, just pure boredom wearing expensive clothing, and because one terrible decision was not enough, they convinced their seconds to fight too. Seconds were supposed to help manage the duel, keep things fair, and sometimes prevent unnecessary bloodshed. These men turned them into bonus participants. The result was a pointless six-man fight. By the end, 3 men were dead, including one of the original duelists, and others were wounded. They had successfully made the afternoon more exciting, but only in the same way a house fire makes dinner less boring. Aristocratic entertainment really needed better regulation. 24. Literary arguments can become heated, but 2 Italian gentlemen took a poetry debate so far that one of them died for an opinion he did not actually have. They were arguing over who was the greater poet, Ludovico Ariosto or Torquato Tasso. Think of it as a 16th century fan war, only instead of furious comments and dramatic essays, there were blades and funeral arrangements. The debate became personal, then furious, then fatal. A duel was fought, and one of the men was mortally wounded. As he lay dying, his opponent, perhaps finally realizing the scale of the stupidity, asked why he had been willing to risk everything for Tasso's honor. With his last breath, the dying man confessed that he had never read a single line of Tasso's work. He had defended a poet he did not know in a debate he could not honestly support until it killed him. That is not intellectual passion. That is pretending to be cultured at the highest possible cost. 25. When a normal love triangle is not dramatic enough, apparently the next step is balloon warfare over Paris. In 1808, Monsieur de Grandpré and Monsieur Lepic were both rivals for the affection of a popular opera dancer named Mademoiselle Tirhevit. Instead of settling the matter on the ground, where gravity is predictable and stupid men are easier to supervise, they arranged one of the most theatrical duels imaginable. Each man rose into the sky in a separate hot air balloon, armed with a musket. Their target was not the other man's body, but his balloon. That somehow made the duel more absurd, not less deadly. Picture the scene. 2 jealous men floating above Paris in wicker baskets, trying to reload muskets while drifting through the air, watched by crowds below who must have wondered whether romance had finally lost its mind. Lepic hit Grandpré's balloon, which fell and killed him. Love was in the air, yes, but so were bullets, ego, and catastrophic decision-making. 26. Mikhail Lermontov was one of Russia's great literary figures, a brilliant poet with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. Unfortunately, that tongue was often pointed at people who were not enjoying the performance. His favorite target was fellow officer Nikolai Martynov, whom Lermontov mocked for his dramatic Caucasian-style clothing and large dagger. He repeatedly called him a mountaineer with a large dagger and turned Martynov's appearance into a running public joke. At first, Martynov endured it. Then he endured it some more. But public humiliation has a limit, especially in a society where honor had the emotional stability of cracked glass. At a party, Lermontov's jokes finally went too far. Martynov challenged him to a duel. Lermontov reportedly still treated the matter lightly and planned to fire into the air as if the whole thing were one more joke. Martynov was not joking. He aimed and shot Lermontov through the heart. Russia lost a major poet because a genius could not stop roasting another man's outfit. 27. Aristocratic problems rarely get more ridiculous than almost fighting a duel over where to park a horse-drawn carriage. In the 1770s, Lord Camden and Lord Townshend arrived at a theater for a night that was supposed to involve entertainment, refinement, and whatever rich men did before pretending they hated drama while creating it constantly. Their coachman got into an argument over who deserved the best position near the entrance. A normal response from the lords would have been to tell their servants to stop embarrassing everyone and go inside. Instead, the quarrel began attaching itself to family honor, because apparently even parking logistics could become noble warfare. One coachman being forced into a worse position was treated like a symbolic defeat. The dispute grew serious enough that the two lords came close to arranging a formal duel. Fortunately, the fight was prevented, but the fact that it was even considered is astonishing. These men almost risked death over 18th century valet parking with horses. 28. A ballroom is supposed to be a place of music, elegance, flirting, and controlled social anxiety. For Admiral de la Suze, however, it became a battlefield because one large German gentleman was apparently waltzing in a deeply offensive manner. The man had not insulted him directly, punched him, or stolen his partner. The Admiral's complaint was that the German was waltzing against him. History gives us no helpful explanation, which makes the accusation even better. Was the man spinning too close? Did his footwork seem hostile? Were his elbows moving with imperial ambition? We may never know. What we do know is that Admiral de la Suze interpreted the dance as a personal insult, serious enough to demand a duel. Imagine going to a ball, enjoying the music, and accidentally becoming a threat to someone's honor because your waltz had bad political energy. It is a terrifying reminder that in old high society, even rhythm could be misread as aggression by a man with pistols and a dangerously thin skin. 29. John Randolph of Roanoke became known as one of America's most eccentric and combative politicians, a man whose temper could flare at almost anything. Apparently, that personality did not begin in Congress. It showed up early during his student days over the pronunciation of a single word. During a discussion, another student said a word differently than Randolph did. To most people, that is a tiny linguistic variation. To Randolph, it seems to have sounded like a direct intellectual assault. The possibility that someone else might pronounce the word correctly and he might not was apparently unbearable. His honor was wounded by phonetics. So he challenged the student to a duel. It was an early preview of the man he would become. Sharp, proud, volatile, and ready to treat disagreement like an ambush. Some people correct pronunciation with a polite comment. Randolph heard a different syllable and reached for the logic of violence. If language is alive, he nearly made it lethal. 30. Kondraty Ryleyev, the Russian poet and future leader in the Decembrist movement, seems to have taken social etiquette with terrifying seriousness. At a high society ball, he greeted a fellow officer, Konstantin Shakoysky. Shakoysky did not respond. Maybe he did not hear him. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe the music was loud, the room was crowded, and everyone was busy performing that exhausting aristocratic ritual of pretending to enjoy each other. But Ryleyev's mind went straight to the darkest interpretation: deliberate public disrespect. A missing hello became a calculated insult. Instead of asking for clarification or deciding that perhaps life could continue after one awkward moment, Ryleyev challenged Shakoysky to a duel. It was social anxiety converted into gunfire. The duel happened, and both men were wounded. Two grown men bled because one greeting may or may not have been ignored at a party. It is hard to imagine a more dramatic punishment for bad reception in a crowded room. 31. Being rejected on the dance floor can sting, but most families do not respond by considering bloodshed. Lord Hervey was not most families. At an 18th century English ball, his sister asked Sir John Astley to dance. Sir John declined and reportedly said she was not to his taste. That is brutally honest in the way a thrown chair is honest. When Lord Hervey heard about the remark, he did not simply think Sir John was rude. He treated it as a public insult to his sister's desirability and therefore a stain on the entire family honor. A polite refusal might have passed. A clumsy excuse might have saved everyone trouble. But not to his taste landed like a social grenade. Lord Hervey challenged Sir John to a duel to defend his sister from the humiliation of being rejected for a dance. It is a useful historical lesson. If you do not want to dance, claim a headache, fake an ankle injury, or flee through a window. Never insult the lady's brother by being too honest. 32. The duel between Lady Almeria Braddock and Mrs. Elphinstone in 1792 began with one of the sharpest weapons in high society, the backhanded compliment. During conversation, Mrs. Elphinstone remarked that Lady Braddock had once been a beautiful woman and added that she certainly did not look her claimed age of 30. Translation: You used to be attractive, and also I think you are lying about your age. It was elegant, polished, and poisonous, the kind of insult that arrives wearing gloves. Lady Braddock was furious. In a world where reputation, beauty, and social standing mattered enormously, this was not treated as harmless gossip. It was an attack. A challenge was issued, and the two women met in Hyde Park. They first used pistols, and when that failed to settle the matter, they continued with swords. Lady Braddock wounded Mrs. Elphinstone, defending her honor against a compliment sharpened into a dagger. It was the 18th century version of a brutal online roast, except the comment section had actual blades. So yes, people really did risk their lives over borscht, umbrellas, carriage parking, and whether frogs could fly. But here's the dangerous part. This list is not even close to complete. Somewhere in history, there is probably an even dumber duel hiding under a pile of powdered wigs and bad decisions. Drop the stupidest duel we missed in the comments, and if your example is more absurd than a man dying over a theater wig, you win the comment section. Like the video if at least one duel made you question civilization, and subscribe, because history only gets weirder when you stop trusting respectable portraits.